As I was preparing for this talk today, I could not stop thinking about a film from 1995 that I really loved called Strange Days. Now, this revealed two things to me. First of all, it revealed that I am definitely getting old if I'm thinking about films in 1995. It also revealed to me how little has actually changed in the ways that we think about and use immersive story-making technologies. Strange Days is set in a slightly dystopian future in which people are addicted to a virtual reality style experience called jacking. Now, instead of jacking entertaining or even adventurous experiences, the people in the film use the technology to be able to viscerally embody somebody else's lived experience. So even 25 years ago, we were already starting to understand that the real power of technology is its capacity to connect us and to reveal our shared experiences. The ubiquity of immersive and experiential storytelling technologies has grown over the last decade. And in these technologies, I'd include virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, but I'd also include things such as touch-activated technologies, immersive soundscapes, and I'd also think about the ways in which we use technologies in our everyday lives as well, to think about those kinds of immersive experiences. The kinds of stories that we can make with these technologies is widely considered to thrill us and to entertain us, definitely. But can it lead to positive social change? Can these types of technologies interact with our stories and our personal narratives to create ever more impactful communication? I think so. The Nieman Lab at Harvard University has last year in fact, put out a report looking at the ways in which immersive, non-immersive and text-based storytelling can create empathy in audiences. Their recommendations for immersive and experiential storytelling was that trust in the narrator is key to creating empathy in audiences. That a clear protagonist to guide us through that experience is consistently more enjoyable for audiences. And that the choice of the narrator and the narrative far outweighs the affordances of the technology. I make stories with underrepresented and marginalised communities and groups, and that report was validating for me. Because what it seems to suggest is that the kinds of stories that we can make with these technologies and the ways in which we can make them impactful is that we must start centering the voices of the people whose experiences we're representing. We must start making stories with and from within communities rather than about communities. In To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch says, "You can never really know anyone until you see things from their perspective, until you're able to step into their skin and walk around in it for a while." These technologies aid us to be able to do that. But why is it important to be able to find meaningful and authentic ways for marginalised communities to tell their stories? We live at a time of impending climate emergency and ever-widening inequality. Distrust, division and disinformation have become the distinguishing features of our digital communication. Being able to see things from someone else's perspective has never been more urgent. And the means through which to create and share those stories has never been more immediate. We've witnessed the power of stories to be able to shift perceptions and change policy in Australia in the last decade through the Royal Commissions into institutionalised childhood sexual abuse, the aged care sector and the financial sector. Now, all the information about the abuses of power, neglect, and wrongdoing had been available in some cases for many years. But it wasn't until the stories of survivors and their families started to make their way into the public consciousness did we collectively demand change. For some very human reason, we needed to hear from another human what it had felt like, what were the consequences, and how desperately they wanted to make sure that it never happened to anybody else ever again. This very human need to hear from another human can in part be explained by neuroscience. Now, there's been a number of studies, some of which have been published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology and Trends in Cognitive Science, show us that stories and narratives offer intrinsic benefits in the four main ways that we process and retain information: through motivation and interest, elaboration, allocation of cognitive resources, and transfer into the long-term memory. Think about that just for a moment. Being able to process and retain information is a pretty crucial part of being a human being. It's crucial to our survival, but it's also crucial to our quality of life. And we're continuously understanding that stories and narratives help us to do that. They help us to think harder about what we've heard, to want to know more about what we've heard. They help us to imagine what would we do in the same situation. And they also help us to remember. Thoughtfully crafted stories help us to see the context of otherwise baffling and overwhelming issues. They also help us to see that shared human experience and also to see that shared humanity with groups who we are actively encouraged to see as other. We need to hear each other's stories. But that's not as simple as it sounds. Who gets to tell their stories, whose stories are believed, and how those stories are represented can tell us a great deal about power, access, and equality in the world that we live in. For groups who've been marginalised either deliberately or inadvertently, the stories that they have play a really important part in their ability to agitate for change. Scott Rankin, who's the founder of Big Heart, which I really believe is the most important arts and social change organisation in Australia, says that for those groups, their stories are very often their last asset. They're valuable because they act as a canary in the coal mine. Because when told in the right way and placed in front of the right audience, those stories help us to see that what we need to change about ourselves and also what we need to shift as a society. But that's not as simple as it sounds either. For many groups, the ways in which they're asked to share and receive information, ways that we see as everyday and normal, can be seen as suspicious. And those ways of sharing and receiving information are really the ways in which they get to tell their stories. So when you think about things such as forms, surveys, focus groups, interviews, for some groups, these can be seen as incredibly intimidating and intrusive and culturally inappropriate. We need to find new ways to tell stories that aren't the same ways we've always told stories or the same ways that we've got to know different communities. So I might kind of sound as though I know what I'm talking about here. And I do, because I have made so many mistakes making stories with groups who have been generous enough to even consider sharing their stories with me. There was the time that I set up a conversation, a casual conversation with a group of women who've experienced incarceration. The purpose of this conversation was to build a relationship to start a research project and a storytelling project. I set up that conversation around a table that had a recording device sitting in the middle of the table. Without even realising it, I had replicated a police interview, and I wondered why they all got up and left the room. And one of them said, "Thanks, detective," on her way out. Or there was the time that I kept trying to guide a woman who I was making a digital story with about the horrific abuse that she had suffered in a church-run children's home. I kept trying to make it fit a structure that I thought would work really well. Her version reflected the trauma and the chaos of her memories. I wanted to make it more palatable for an audience. We both ended up in tears in that process. I've learnt to do better. I've learnt to be led by the people who own their stories. And I've learnt to use technology to make stories with rather than about people. One of those projects where I got to demonstrate how I'd learned a little bit better, and I continued to learn better on that project, is Census of Community. In this project, the research team and I wanted to find ways to be able to represent a multiplicity of perspectives about one single place. And to do that, we wanted to shy away from traditional forms of narratives, writing something, making a film, or even a performance. We wanted to get the people who live in that space to tell us their memories using their senses. What did it smell like? What did it sound like? Were there particular tactile memories they had of that place? And then we wanted to create an immersive experience for other people to experience that place with them. The site that we were using was the QUT campus at Kelvin Grove. And it's a multifaceted site. The traditional owners are the Turrbal and Yagara people. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was the home of army barracks, and it's currently a university campus that also has public housing and a range of independently run businesses there. In a theatre space, we projected a series of overlapping maps on the floor that helped to show the shift in the landscape over time. And we got the participants to walk around on those maps and locate a place where they had a memory, and then to think about a sense that was associated with that memory and write a little bit about it and stick it on the map. We then developed some of those memories a little bit more. So when the audience came through, there are a range of objects that we had touch-activated technology attached to, and so there was a lamp that when you turned it on, it triggered a hologram of a dancer to the unforgettable strains of Careless Whisper by Wham. That was someone's memory. There was also a coffee grinder that when you took the lid off to smell the coffee, a short film started playing about a community cafe that was a home away from home for many of the residents. When you ask people how they inhabit a space, and you allow them a range of languages, immersive, evocative, tactile, to tell you how they inhabit a place, that's when we can start to understand a place and its people, the strengths and the challenges of that place and its people, as told by them, not by information or data that's gathered about them. We need to revolutionise the ways in which we make and share stories. We need to courageously and creatively find ways to make stories that centre the voices of First Nations people, of LGBTQI people. We need to centre refugee voices, neurodiverse and differently abled voices, working class voices, regional voices. Why? Because the same old voices and the same old stories and the same old ways that we communicate can barely even acknowledge, let alone address, the urgent issues that face us. And they most certainly cannot even begin to convey the innovative solutions to some of those issues that already exist in communities. I'd like to end with a story. This is a road that leads out of Roma. It's a town I grew up in. Roma's in one of the poorest electorates with the highest youth unemployment rate in the country. And according to ABC Vote Compass, it also happens to be the most conservative electorate. Last year, I was in Roma doing a series of workshops with young people, finding out what kinds of services and support they needed to be able to access and participate in arts and cultural activities that are meaningful for them. And also, what kinds of digital skills do they want to develop to imagine a future for themselves? I went to the same state high school that I was doing the workshops in. When I walked into the art room, all I could see was an interactive exhibition. There was a boat sitting inside a jail cell that had been made out of maps of the world. The students had created this exhibition to protest the indefinite detention of asylum seekers. This in the most conservative electorate in the country. Later, when I was talking to a local councillor who has lived in remote Queensland all of their lives, they desperately wanted me to understand and pass on to the funding body the urgent lack of access to mental health services for young people. And to do that, they told me the story of a community member who'd attempted suicide, and the very closest facility was a 4-hour drive away. You see, data and information can tell us some things about a place and its people, but it can't tell us everything. Technology can connect us, but only so much. When we harness immersive and experiential technologies and combine those with the voices and the stories of a people and their place, that's when we start to see something new, something more hopeful, something more nuanced. Stories show us who we are. They also show us who we can be. Thank you.